I think we've got a pretty good crowd in the meeting room, so it's probably time to start. So I'd like to start by welcoming everybody to this session of the conference on Ireland's COVID crisis response. I'm Philip O'Connell. I'm director of the UCD Geary Institute for Public Policy, and we're co-hosting this with colleagues Liam Delaney, Orla Doyle at UCD, and Stephen Kinsella at University of Limerick. This session is on the state response to the crisis. I'd like to emphasize to everybody this is our very first Zoom conference, so please bear with us if there are technical difficulties. We'll do our best to sort them out as we go. So the format for today is that we're going to have speakers followed by a question and answer session. Questions can be submitted to me by clicking on the chat function, which is on the bottom of your Zoom screen, submitting a question, and then I'll select questions and try to collate them and put them to the speakers after the three speakers have spoken. Just by way of introduction, it's been 7 weeks since the first case of the coronavirus was detected in Ireland. It's 4 weeks since the schools were closed. And it's 3 weeks since social distancing restrictions closed down most economic and social activity. And as the crisis has grown, the state has come to the fore. Most immediately in terms of running the health service, but also and much more deeply in terms of protecting people's lives, protecting people's incomes and their livelihoods and so on. The state has played a vital and enormous role in the immediate response to the crisis. And that immediate response is one important element of what we hope to learn from our speakers today. In the longer term, the COVID pandemic will leave a wide range of public policy challenges in its wake, in the labour market, in education, in business, transport, climate change, education, fiscal policy, just to name a few off the top of one's head. And it's important to anticipate now what those challenges are so that we can prepare and explore potential responses. So to help us to do that, we have three very important and very engaged speakers to talk about the issues. We're going to start off with a talk by Robert Watt. Robert is the Secretary General of the Department of Expenditure and Reform. Robert's an economist with experience in both the public and the private sectors. He has responsibility for both formation and implementation of policy across all areas of government. Robert was centrally involved in the recovery from the fiscal crisis of the state in the last crisis, and he managed the relationship with the European Commission, ECB, and IMF Troika. He's also driven the process of reform and modernization across the public sector since the last crisis. We're very lucky to have him here. Second speaker is John McKeown. John is Secretary General of Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection. Now in that role, John has led a department that has responded extraordinarily rapidly to provide income support to vast numbers of people unable to work or to earn a living as this crisis has evolved. At the last count, and this may be old news now, but we reckon about 700,000 Irish residents are in receipt of payments from his department. So a crucial player in this. John also has experience in both the private and the public sectors. He led the reform process at DSP in designing and implementing the Pathways to Work program in response to the last unemployment crisis, a program which saw the unemployment rate fall from 16 to less than 15% in relatively recent years. So we're back at the coalface again. And finally, Michelle Norris is a colleague of mine. She's a professor of social policy at the School of Social Policy, Social Justice and Social Work at UCD. Her teaching and her research interests focus on housing policy and urban regeneration and homelessness. In addition to a highly productive academic career, Michelle also has made a number of important contributions to public policy in Ireland. She's appointed by successive Irish governments to NESC and to the Housing Finance Agency, of which she's now chair, and she was also appointed to the board of the Land Development Agency. So thank all three speakers for agreeing to participate. Very welcome to all the participants. I'm going to turn over to Robert now. So people are going to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we're going to turn over to a question and answer session. So Robert, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Philip. And good morning, everybody. And particularly thank Philip and his colleagues for organising this event, which is really fantastic. As was mentioned at the introduction, policymakers are grappling with many different challenges. And it's really important that we benefit from all the inputs and wisdom across all the different sectors of the policy community. And this is a great opportunity for us to set out with John and Michelle some things that we're doing, our response, and critically to get some feedback on how we're doing and what further challenges lie ahead. So I'm going to talk about the economic response, and I'm going to go through these slides fairly quickly, just to bring out some of the, hopefully, the more salient points in what we're doing. Obviously, the shock, as we all know, it's a unique, exogenous, both supply and demand shock, severe reduction in incomes and expenditures for certain sectors and households, direct impact from the social distancing measures that the government has introduced. It's quite a broad economy-wide shock now, and we estimate that about 40% of the private sector workforce are either temporarily laid off, benefiting from the pandemic payment, or on the wage subsidy scheme. The second round effects of this are, of course, uncertain, like many elements of this crisis. But a concern will be the confidence effects that this is having, even for households that haven't been directly affected, what impact it might have on confidence and leading to increases in precautionary savings. And likewise for firms, a tendency maybe for firms that are doing well, but still to hoard cash and to act in a more conservative way because of concerns about the future. And of course, there are trade effects, trade impacts. Small open economy, as we all know, most of what we consume, we import, most of what we produce, we export. And we will see those trade effects, those negative trade effects over the next weeks and months. There are also issues around financial market stress. And just reflecting back on the last crisis, which was a financial markets crisis originally, that obviously impacted upon the real economy, and the real economy then had a further impact upon financial markets, and we had that doom loop where the financial stresses amplify the problems in the real economy. But there is, of course, significant uncertainty and when economies will return back to some sort of normality. There is plenty of discussion about U's and V's and L. We sort of prefer the Nike swoosh. And this isn't what ourselves, the Department of Finance, are forecasting, but I think this is an interesting illustration of, I think, of what the recovery will look like. We're all familiar with that Nike symbol. The extent of the demand shock, the ESRI, central bank, have produced similar assessments. The Department of Finance will publish our assessment next week, which will be similar. Declines in activity, 7-8%, maybe more. In the short run for this quarter, falls of 25% or more in activity. And of course, significant reductions, almost 100% in some sectors: accommodation and food, retail, wholesale, arts, culture, recreation, many transport sectors, and to date construction. And it's interesting to look at the sectors affected. They account for a very high share of employment, but they tend to be sectors where we all know which are lower paid and where the added value is lower: distribution, transport, hotels, and arts and entertainment. So while the employment shock is greater, the shock to output could actually be lower. And the least affected sectors, those where remote working can continue, ICT, finance, and insurance, are least affected. Obviously, manufacturing, it's mixed because there's some manufacturing that's continuing, and a lot of it has been closed down also. So a mixed bag. In terms of the demand shock on those who are unemployed, and John, no doubt, will talk about this in a bit more detail. You can see the sectors. I hope the graph is a bit cluttered, but the real story is accommodation. So almost 135,000 people who were working accommodation are now benefiting from the payment. Construction, 100,000. Wholesale, retail, 95,000. And if you look at some of the sectors in accommodation and food, around 80% of people who worked in those sectors beforehand are now either benefiting from the pandemic payment or the wage subsidy scheme. And that ratio then falls for different sectors. In construction, it's about 60%, so about 67% of people who were in those sectors are now either unemployed or on the wage subsidy scheme. And you can see the effect across different sectors. Of course, very important for the exit strategy. More likely that construction can go back to work, and parts of retail, wholesale, transport before food and accommodation, and the effects of how that unwinds will obviously differ depending on sectors, but the overall macro effect we can get some sense from looking at the employment numbers. OECD had done some very interesting cross-country comparators, and everybody be aware of the downsides of this type of analysis. Obviously, for Ireland, it used GDP, which isn't the best measure, as we all know. And I wouldn't be too concerned here about looking at the falls in absolute terms. Ireland 15%, some other countries much higher. I think the really interesting message from the OECD is that the impact on countries will be differentiated. And a lot of the reason for that is that some countries, and it's interesting to look at the numbers in detail, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, have a very high dependency on tourism. It's actually quite startling when you look at the numbers. In Spain, 15% plus of people in employment. I know a lot of seasonal, but in employment at the peak would be in tourism. And this shows that the impact across Europe will be different, and also, of course, speaks to the need for significant solidarity to be shown across Europe to help us deal with this crisis. The OECD work, for those who are interested, is actually worth having a detailed review of. So the policy challenge is quite clear, I think. 3 dimensions: demand efficiency, liquidity, and potential insolvency. And the objective of government policy has been to replace lost demand, support incomes, and prevent viable companies going bust. Various liquidity response by the central bank, and I won't touch on that. People will know what the central banks have been up to. The role of the fiscal authorities in Ireland elsewhere has been used the state's balance sheet to maximum extent to enable automatic stabilisers to work, which are important, and also to then have discretionary direct fiscal action. And also, finally, the third element is to guarantee additional lending and liquidity. So in order to ensure that banks continue to lend and don't become overly risk averse, there's a role of the state to actually guarantee portions of the capital that the banks have to set aside to facilitate lending. So they're the 3 elements broadly what the state is about. Constraints on action, and this will be unusual for somebody like me to say, but fiscal capacity is of second order importance for now. But of course, the buildup of debt will be significant, and the effectiveness and efficiency of fiscal measures is still crucial. So while we're less concerned about issues about moral hazard or dead weight than we might be in normal circumstances, we still, of course, need to focus on efficiency and effectiveness to ensure that the measures are impactful and make sense given the level of resources allocated to those measures. The duration of the shock is critical, of course, for the sustainability of actions. But for now, and for what we've been trying to do the last few weeks, it's really been speed and impact has been the most urgent challenge facing the government. We've tried to keep in our heads in the department and across the system sort of basic principles of intervention for a crisis, so rapid response and operational impact. So we might like to have a nicer policy, but really, or a perfect policy, but best is what we can have to settle for on this occasion. And it's really about maximising the speed and the impact of those interventions. Don't overpromise. Very clear instruction from our minister at the very start. He never wants to go out to announce things at press conferences unless he can answer basic questions about the detail. I think that's very important for the credibility of the system and for the response that we're all working on. Of course, driven by evidence bases and all the work that we've all done over the years in the civil service and academia about things that work and don't work, but of course to accept the uncertainty. And when we make decisions, we're all conscious of the decision theory and having that in the back of our minds that if we do have to make decisions, that we need to be very clear that we're making decisions that we don't actually have the full information. At least knowing we don't know or know what we don't know is very important when we're actually making decisions. Dead weight, minimize where possible. Moral hazard, we just don't sweat it because this is a different type of crisis and we just have to park that. Importance of sequencing, the importance of sequencing of different measures, I think as well, deserves some attention as opposed to the nature of the interventions and the size. And of course, there are many issues around equity. How equitable are some of these interventions? Are we being fair to different groups within society and to different sectors? And I think when the government starts to unwind some of the lockdown measures, these issues of equity, and particularly equity between different sectors, will become more to the fore. Types of responses internationally, again, everybody will know this: investment in public health system, income supports, liquidity measures, central bank measures, but also deferral of tax and commercial rates, which can be benefit to companies, bank debt holidays and forbearance, guarantee loan schemes and various working initiatives, work capital initiatives we'll talk about in a moment. And two other elements that some countries have gone for, which we haven't yet: grants and open-ended grants to SMEs in some cases, and capital equity or different types of preferred capital investment in specific companies. We haven't gone for that in Ireland either, but we will have to at some stage. We have which I hope people can see, a neat summary across a selection of countries about the types of interventions that countries have pursued and where we sit. So there's a lot of commonality between countries. This, of course, just focuses on the qualitative assessment. It doesn't look at the quantity, but there's a lot of commonality across different countries in terms of the response. And as policymakers, we are in touch with our colleagues across Europe and elsewhere as part of the OECD and the European Union, of course. We're talking to our colleagues all the time and sharing information on how we're getting on and how we're intervening. But that's a snapshot on Ireland. We have done many of the things other countries have done, of course, and this whole intervention has been kept under constant review. Some of the policy choices then, I think this is very interesting. There is a difference between direct, immediate fiscal and what we call provisioning. And this is to be very careful when we look at some of the packages from across the world. And people have seen assessments done by the OECD, the IMF, saying that country X has a package of 10% of GDP. The really critical thing is to look at the detail of this. There's an enormous difference between direct fiscal supports through income or wage subsidies or grants or so on, versus saying that you're going to commit to a fund of X or you're going to facilitate lending of X. Provisioning is not the same as direct action. It doesn't have an impact unless, of course, the funds are allocated, unless the lending happens. Clearly, direct fiscal action is more immediate and can have benefits for households and firms faster, and that's been our priority, while, of course, looking at and implementing some aspects of loan guarantee schemes as well. But I think it's very important to distinguish between those two elements. Policy choices, there are many considerations here. People talk about helicopter money, which has different definitions, but as the Hong Kong approach early on in this crisis, or in the US, to basically allocate a fixed amount of cash per week or month for all households, that might be appropriate for countries that don't have very well developed social welfare systems or safety nets, don't have workable systems for delivery, but not appropriate for countries like Ireland, most countries in Europe, particularly Northern European, Scandinavian countries that have delivery systems. Much better to what we call drone money, which is in effect targeted money, targeted on those households that need it and targeted on those firms that need it. And that, of course, enables us to have more of an impact and ensure the effectiveness of the fiscal actions. Big policy issues about households versus companies. And this sort of policy choice really drove our discussion of the wage subsidy scheme. So we wanted to have a scheme which supported liquidity for companies, but was linked to sustaining employment. So we made it conditional on employment. So it was a scheme that money was transferred to employers, but of course it was conditional on people being kept in their jobs to benefit households. A big debate in Ireland elsewhere about open-ended grants. We don't like the notion of cash transfers out there to companies because we just don't know, we don't have a criteria. We are looking at this, but we don't have a very clear criteria that can differentiate between different needs. But again, something kept under review. I'll just very quickly go through some of the measures, and I won't be able to go through all of this, but in terms of the health illness side of things, one of the first things the government did was to change the illness benefits. So there was a 6-day rule that you wouldn't get the first 6 days of payments, and also to enhance the payment to 350 a week. And this was at the start of the crisis. The government's concern was that a lot of people are going to get ill. A lot of people will have to be off work, and therefore we needed people to actually say they were sick and self-isolate and leave work because we didn't want people obviously to spread the infection. As it turned out, the lockdown and the reduction in employment has been much more significant than the numbers of people on illness benefits. So it was interesting that the focus initially was on how can we ensure people have clear monetary incentives, or at least the supports that they can be off work. Obviously, the crisis has evolved in a different way. Investment in the health system, and I don't have time to go through all the investments, but it's about 2 billion additional funding, 1% of GNI star. A lot of that, as people will know, will be buying PPE from China, over 200 million, various expenditure on reagents for testing. A lot of it, though, is more staff in the system, more spending. So it does actually have, well, it's not, of course, the objective, it does actually have an impact in terms of supporting demand and activity domestically. Just in terms of income supports, and John will talk about this in detail, so I won't go through it. A significant increase in the pandemic payment so a single person would be on 204 a week, that payment up to 350. I think over half, 50-60% of people will be single people who would be eligible for the lower payment. So that's obviously an increase on what they would get normally if they'd been unemployed. But for a lot of people, of course, it's still a good deal less than they would have been on previously. As of data I had for earlier this week, 530,000 people on the scheme. The wage subsidy scheme, an attempt to keep people in employment, keep them close to their employer, has been successful to an extent. And we hope that more people who are on the pandemic payment will migrate to the wage subsidy scheme over the next few weeks to keep that close relationship with their employer. We have around 130, 140,000 employees on that scheme. The details quite complex. Originally, we said 70% of your net pay for January, February, up to a maximum of 410. And the minister announced this week to increase that to 85% and to waive some of the tapering rules so that employers can top up to €350 a week without reduction in the tapering arrangements. So that's tried to ensure there was some discussion. We don't know the extent of it, of course, but about people who were leaving the work to claim the pandemic payment. I don't know how many, but there was some conversation about that. So there's a concern. So the minister make changes to improve the attractiveness for employers and employees to stay attached in the workplace. We estimate this will cost over $4 billion for a 10-12 week period, and income supports in total amount to about 2% of GNI star for that 12-week period. Of course, there might be lower costs during that period if people go back to work faster, but some of the costs may go beyond the end of this quarter, which I think is likely. The guaranteed schemes, variety of different liquidity supports, which involves exchequer money upfront or exchequer money guaranteeing. I won't go through the detail of this. This is one area we're going to have to do more on, significantly more in the next few weeks. One of the interesting schemes here is that for one of the schemes, I think it's the SBCI Covid-19 lending, the first loss, so if there's a bad debt accrues, the first loss is met by the EIB. So the EIB has supported this, and this has the potential for a much wider European scheme where the EIB can support lending. And of course, any cost then will be hit centrally rather than individual budgets of member states. And I think this can be important from the solidarity point of view to support those countries that are most adversely affected, but also I think to have a more uniform approach across the Eurozone. So there's more scope in terms of some of these schemes, particularly the one which is part funded by the EIB. Liquidity measures such as deferral of tax, commercial rates. Again, a targeted approach was adopted here. So companies that are in difficulty, the local authority will pause the commercial rates and likewise for the revenue commissioners when companies are in difficulty. These measures are about 1% of GNI star as well, but again, the costing of this, it's evolving. Finally, banking credit measures, various forbearance initiatives, a deferral of up to 3 months on loan repayments. Interesting data again from this week from the Banking Federation, 45,000 mortgage customers already have been granted payment breaks in their mortgage already, and 14,000 small and medium-sized enterprises. So a significant amount of forbearance already been introduced. And I think that's been the main focus of the banking system so far, has been to put a pause on repayments for many households and businesses. To summarize these measures then, so what we call us economists, and sorry for the non-economists on the call, us economists talk about obviously counter-cyclical measures, health spending, income supports, liquidity support. So we think about 4% of GNI star. At this stage, really more is needed in relation to loan schemes and lending. Of course, in addition, automatic stabilizers are also working. And what this amounts to, and again, subject to enormous uncertainty, a fiscal deficit of the order of 8% of national income for this year is the type of numbers we're looking at. But of course, we will see. This will be a much larger deficit, of course, for this quarter, and that deficit would be lower. But for the year as a whole, we're looking at that type of number, which is about 20 billion plus in terms of the general government balance. We're trying to all the time look at, well, what's working, what's not working, and our colleagues in DSP, John will talk in a moment, and revenue are looking. We've got fantastic data and analysis of how this is working for individual firms. ISME did a survey which showed very significant, obviously, access to the wage subsidy scheme, revenue refunds and forbearance, and also business loan payment break, a lower share. We think that latter share will rise significantly as banks complete the process of those applications that they're receiving. Some further issues, next issues, of which there are many, and Philip at the start mentioned a variety of issues, all of which are really critical and really important. In terms of the economic stabilization task, requests for specific company sector supports. So the government will be asked to support specific sectors, specific companies, and how do we do that? And this is a very difficult challenge. So we're trying to work on various principles. How do we protect the taxpayers' interests while supporting companies and activity? How do we differentiate between different companies and sectors that may need support? What type of support? Is it equity or debt, other forms of preferred capital? What type of collateral arrangements? How is the relationship with other creditors, on trade creditors and others? This is a complex area and one that we know we're going to have answers to soon. But how do we do this? How do we do this in a sensible way? Related to all this is the whole question of, so if you think about it, we've been looking at the flow. Of course, for many firms, there will be a stock of debt, a growing stock of debt. And we need to ensure that companies are in a position to grow and invest and hire people into the future. And if their balance sheets are impaired, that will limit future growth. So how do we look?
Robert, you seem to have frozen.
Okay, okay.
You're back, but
yeah, can you hear me?
About winding it up in the next couple of minutes?
Right now, because I thought we were doing very well to get to the end. So yeah, two more comments. So the impairment of balance sheets is important. Can you hear me? Yep. You can all hear me okay? Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Ron. So planning for the recovery. So key issue, of course, is the easing of restrictions, when and how that will happen. The unwinding of the various policy measures that will come alongside the easing of restrictions. Fiscal policy, very important that we avoid pro-cyclical responses, what colloquially is austerity. So there's a bit of a strange debate here. There is no need for us to think about austerity or cutbacks in spending or increase in taxes. Most of the deficit is temporary, cyclical. It will be reduced as people get back to work. It might take longer than 3 months, of course. It might be 6 months, 9 months, a year, but eventually the economy will recover. So very important to avoid pro-cyclical policy. There is a structural hit to the economy, tourism, deglobalization, and the policy response needs to focus on specific sectors. Active labour market programs, a big area. What can we do around infrastructure and public housing? So finally, and I conclude, Philip, on this, unprecedented shock. Yeah, speedy response to date, but of course much more to do and many policy challenges across many different areas. I think finally, on an optimistic note, the economy is much better placed to deal with this shock than we were in the early 1980s or in the recession 2008, 2010. The economy is better balanced. We don't have the same level of credit explosion that we had. The fiscal position is more robust. So I think we're better placed to deal with these enormous challenges given where the economy is now. So I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you, Robert. I think that was particularly useful. It gave us a panoramic overview of the state response. It put some numbers on the scale of that response, which I personally found really, really useful, and ended with some reassurance about the state that we started this crisis in. And so that's really, really useful to kick things off. Thank you, Robert. So we're going to move to John McKeown from the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection. Over to you, John.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to start actually by giving a usual disclaimer that I give whenever I speak at events like this, which is I don't speak for the department, I don't speak for the minister, I don't speak for the government, and actually a lot of the time I'm not even giving my own views. What I want to do today is really to do a couple of things. I want to maybe give a more operational take on some of the issues that Robert just spoke about, but I will talk a bit about the policy context. I will describe what we did and what informed our approach. I will, towards the end, and this is a bit where my disclaimer really kicks in, is I want to acknowledge the questions that have been raised by some commentators in terms of where we are now and where we go next, and maybe suggest some questions in turn that they might need to consider when they're proposing ideas. Robert has already covered some of this, and I think you did as well, Philip, at the outset. I mean, we're talking about COVID now, and we're having a policy conference on something that really only kicked off 4 weeks ago in terms of my particular interest, which is the labour market and social protection. And when you look at what has happened and what we've done in that time, we have actually moved at a fairly frightening pace. One colleague of mine has described it as trying to run really fast on a tightrope treadmill. If you can kind of try to picture that image, it's incredibly easy to take a misstep, but you have to take a step or you'll be thrown off. So, you know, we've been moving at such a pace that sometimes we haven't had the opportunity to pause and reflect. So sessions like this are important, as Robert said, for those of us involved, to actually take a breath, get input and feedback from people who are interested in public policy, and take that feedback and reflect it in ourselves. So hopefully that's what I and Robert and others will get out of today, and hopefully be useful for the audience too. We're all familiar with this chart. This is the famous curve flattening call to arms, and it appears that the measures taken, uncomfortable as they have been for many people, have helped do just that. There is, as we all know, a consequence to those measures, and in effect what has happened is that the peak has been moved out of the health sector into the wider economy, really into the labour market. And Robert has already gone through some of the numbers, but maybe just to put it in context, the red chart there, or the red line, shows the average inflow of new job seeker claims on a monthly basis and what happened in the last 4 weeks. Obviously the solid red bit is what actually happened, and the dotted red bit is a little bit of conjecture of mine. But you can see that we've received at this stage, actually it's up to yesterday, we've had 4 years worth of claims in 4 weeks, which has put huge strain on the system, and has put us under huge pressure in this department. Just importantly to say about the chart, that is the inflow. That doesn't necessarily invert that and make it into a U-shaped recovery. Obviously there's a stock that has to be brought down as well. Another analogy is that of squeezing the balloon, and when people talk about public policy and public policy choices, in effect, if you compress a balloon in one spot, you put the pressure somewhere else. And in this case, we've acted as a nation, not just as a government, I think, but as a nation, to protect our health service, and not purely for the purpose of the health service. I mean, in the UK, the public messaging is all around protecting the NHS, but it's important to know why we do that, and we do it in order to protect the lives of citizens. That's the public policy choice. I don't think the measures we took were taken in full knowledge of the likely consequences on the economy and on the labour market. And I don't think you've ever seen a public policy choice made so real or so stark, that obviously we prioritised the health and well-being of our citizens over the economic welfare of the labour market. And that's a very stark policy choice, which has been made for very good reasons. In terms of, you know, turning to my own area of interest, which is social protection and labour market, actually, we feel, and it feels like we're in a much different place than we were 4 weeks ago. But when you step back a little bit, it is kind of familiar. So if I just talk through this slide for a moment, and if you look at the box on the left, the normal focus of what we do in our department in terms of income and employment supports and the policy priorities. And the first policy priority for us, and I make no apologies for this, I always say it, is to get people into payment quickly. You know, a former Taoiseach was reported as saying, you know, that something was all very good in practice, but what was it like in theory? And sometimes I'm inclined to kind of go operate in that mode myself, but in practice, that doesn't cut the mustard. What you've got to do when people incur a loss of income is get them into payment quickly, because if you can't operationalise policy, it means nothing. So every policy has to be tested in terms of its operational efficiency and its operational reality. And so that's what we do. In terms of the value, when we're looking at the value of the payment and how we construct the payments, normally it's about mitigating poverty, while at the same time ensuring that we protect the work incentive and trying to hit that balance between an income support payment which insulates people from poverty and deprivation, but at the same time ensures that for people to return to work. And that's where activation and supporting people into new employment comes from. You know, it's not just about the efficiency of the labour market, though that's a very key concern. But we know, and the evidence is, that, you know, people's welfare and well-being is best in employment than it is out of employment. That's both for the individual and for society. Obviously, we're conscious, particularly during recessionary times, of the role of social protection as an automatic stabilisation. And as Robert has said, control on costs and minimising dead weight, dealing with things like moral hazard, you know, bang per buck in terms of the taxpayer and the costs on the economy are all factors that come into the equation. If you look during the COVID period, there have been some differences and there are more nuances. Getting people into payment quickly is still a top priority. In fact, it's probably a bigger priority now, because if you think about it, we've now got, between ourselves and the revenue wage subsidy scheme, close to 1 million people who are getting some form of income support from the state. If we didn't act quickly to do that, and if we couldn't operationalise and deliver it quickly, whether 1 million people who saw no money coming into their bank accounts would support the public health measures that have had to be implemented might have been questionable. So it was absolutely critical that whatever we did, we could get people into payment quickly. In terms of the value of the payment, we did introduce the value of the payment in terms of, I'm very conscious of the need to absorb the income shock for the reasons I just spoke about. The loss of employment now is somewhat different to the loss of employment in normal times. In normal times, somebody who loses employment normally has some exit package from their employer. They have an opportunity, particularly in the economy as it was up to March, to get back into work fairly quickly. Those factors weren't at play here, so we had to be very conscious of that in terms of the value of the income support payment and what we should do there. In terms of the employment or activation focus, well, actually, it's not so much about getting people into new employment. It's as much about trying to retain the link with the existing employment, not getting people into a new job, but making sure they stay in their existing job or get back into their old job. That's what it's about. And we've also, in terms of the stabilisation effect, tried to put stress income flow and expenditure, and control on costs hasn't gone away. But I think it's fair to say it's really the first 3 bullet points there that really informed our approach. There are 3 microeconomic concerns: get quick payment with no delay, shock absorption to maintain public confidence and social cohesion, and as far as possible retaining the link with employment. So what did we actually do? Well, in terms of getting people into payment quickly, we did introduce 3 new temporary, and I'd emphasise that word, temporary flat rate payments that could be implemented quickly, and that was one of the attractions of a flat rate payment to deal with the scale. We had to process over 800,000 claims, so it was important that the payments would be easy to administer, and that's why we have flat rate payments. In terms of the value of the payment and the absorption of the income shock, we did set the flat rate payment at equivalent to the 2 adult household rate in normal times. And Robert's already referred to that a single adult is doing much better on welfare now than they would have previously. But obviously, if you do a flat rate payment, you have to calibrate it at higher than just a single household level because there's a multiplicity of household types. So we set it at a 2 adult household rate of 350. And that's equivalent to 100% of average take-home pay in the sectors that have been most affected, retail and hospitality, particularly in the early weeks. In terms of retaining the link with the employer, we introduced the employer subsidy scheme and developed and introduced that quite quickly. It gives between 70 and 85% of pre-COVID salary up to €410. And we know now that that's proving popular, and I can see that in our own figures that there are more people now moving on to that scheme than there are coming onto the COVID unemployment payment. So we're quite pleased about that and quite optimistic about its impact. We've also had to obviously change things like redundancy law. There's the concept of a temporary layoff and redundancy, which is 6 weeks, which obviously wasn't going to cut the mustard this time around. So we extended that. that temporary layoffs can last longer, and that gives some relief both to employers and employees. The payment in terms of the income support at an economy-wide basis is at a higher value. It's available to all workers, including those already on welfare payments. So a lot of people who are normal welfare payments also work. So carers can work, people with disabilities can work, lone parents can work. And normally we say people can't have two welfare payments. And in this instance, for those people who had an employment income that were of working age, we said, well, those people, we would substitute their income with the COVID payment. And that's about keeping money flowing in the economy. In terms of control and cost, we have gone towards an ex post rather than ex ante checks. And normally we would check people's incomes, their social insurance contributions, the status of their employment as part of the process of approving a claim. It's not that we've turned a blind eye to that completely. We still do some checks, but we actually are doing much more ex ante checks, getting people into payment and then checking are there issues. And we can do that largely, I would say, because we have a high confidence based on the high level of safe registrations, the infamous public service card. You know, about 90% of working age people in Ireland have already registered and verified their identity with the department. That meant that we could much more confidently move to a fast and quick payment process without all the normal checks we would normally apply. So I want to turn now to some of the commentary which has started to emerge, particularly over the last week or two, about where we go next and have these changes. Are they going to survive beyond the crisis period? And I suppose just to show that in a couple of images. In some ways, we've charted a new course for our employment, our job seeker payments, separate to our other payments as a consequence of the crisis. Where we go next, I suppose the question is, do we revert to normal? And I think certainly that is the expectation. That was the basis and the premise on which these extraordinary measures were introduced, that they were temporary for a 12-week period of time or thereabouts, and couldn't and wouldn't be sustained beyond that. And I think the Minister of Finance was very clear about that in the Dáil yesterday, that, you know, we may have to review, and as Robert said, there may be a transition period, but it's probably wrong to think that this is a map to a new future. Some people believe and would argue it should be, and that's certainly a question we should and do need to consider. Do we need to chart a new course for welfare generally, and are flat rate payments the way to go, universal payments the way to go, and so on? And yet again, other people have said, well, actually, maybe there shouldn't be such a big realignment, but maybe a slight realignment without absolutely being clear about what such a realignment might look like. I think there are some questions to ponder in the sense of anyone kind of proposing or thinking about those changes. And I won't go through all of these. I think there's 12 or 13 questions on this slide, but I suppose really, you know, why did we make the changes that we did? Are the changes that we made during on a temporary basis during a period of crisis things that should survive into a more stable period? I know this is a very simplistic analogy, but if I have to run to make the bus because I'm late leaving home and risk a heart attack in doing so, should I be running to make the bus every day, even when I'm on time? Simple analogy, but I think it makes the point. You've really got to position the changes that have happened in the context of the public confidence issues, in the context of the macro and the microeconomic issues that for time. And we really got to figure out, will those circumstances persist? And if so, for how long? We've got to think about what shape will a recovery take. Will a recovery, you know, be managed? Will it be allowed to happen by itself? Will it vary by sector? And there is some reason to believe it will absolutely vary by sector. Will it vary by geography? So, for example, if you look at the incidence of the COVID illness around the country, you know, you've got certain parts where there's very dark red on the maps we all see, and other parts where it's very light and very pale. So would it be possible to, you know, soften constraints in some areas of the country but keep them tighter in others? Are there age, you know, maybe younger people, has been suggested by one commentator, could get back to work more quickly? Are there other characteristics? So all of those things will inform where we go next. The other thing, maybe looking towards the longer term, is a question about whether new ways of working will persist. So we've now got a lot of people who are home working, part-time working, and so on. And I think that really does mean, where's the line between work life and home life? And what does that mean for things like whether people are gig economy or permanent employees? What does that mean for labour market and social protection? What does it mean for in-work income supports if those new ways of working continue into the future? And I think obviously in terms of looking at the options, you've got to look at, well, what are the implications for equity? Flat rate payment is not necessarily a terribly equitable way of doing things. What are the implications for stability? 4 to 5 billion over 12 weeks. Could that be sustained? The social welfare budget's already about 35% of current public expenditure, probably going to get close to 50% this year maybe. Can that really be sustained? What are the trade-off against other public policy objectives? As I said before, what are the operational implications? And finally, and I suppose most importantly, what will the public expect? And what will we as citizens support or tolerate into the future in terms of the welfare model? And they're all questions to which there are no easy answers. Even though some people would take the opportunity of this crisis to present them, that possibly we've come to a new way of working that we should sustain. I think these are all legitimate questions that will need to be considered before we get too carried away with ourselves. And I just want to maybe leave it at that. And that's my piece. Thank you very much.
Many thanks indeed, John. That was a very, very useful overview of where we are now and the scale of the response from the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection, which is really quite extraordinary in terms of the number of people signed up for payments. You also raise a number of very interesting questions, which I think we might try to return to when we open the session to the questions and answers. And speaking of questions and answers, I've been receiving a number of questions as people speak. So we'll pose those questions to speakers at the end of the session. So please feel free to submit additional questions as our next speaker is speaking. And so I'd like to now introduce Michelle Norris. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Philip, and thanks for inviting me to present this morning. I'm going to examine the housing homelessness responses to the COVID-19 crisis. And just to start, it seems like a long time ago now, but in the general election in February, housing and homelessness was foremost among voting concerns. We know this from the exit poll. And this was reflected in really unprecedented attention being paid to housing and homelessness in the political party manifestos. So in my presentation today, I want to examine the implications which COVID-19 have for housing and homelessness. Just some of the implications they have for some of the proposals which were floated in the general election by the different political parties. We still don't have a government, so I'll keep my comments general. And also then, I want to focus in particular on some ideas I have for the role which housing and homelessness policy could play in the response to the pandemic. And I have 5 proposals in particular I wanted to discuss. As Philip mentioned, as well as being an academic in UCD, I'm also on the board of the Housing Finance Agency, which finances social housing, and on the interim board of the Land Development Agency. But my comments here today are my own personal opinion as an academic, because both the LDA and the Housing Finance Agency are policy takers and implementers rather than policy makers. The policy makers baking is up to the civil servants and the politicians. But just to deal with the first kind of issue I mentioned, first of all, prior to the COVID-19 emergency, we had some very significant housing challenges. Foremost among them, in my view, are the lack of social housing supply and the severe difficulties low-income people in accessing private rented accommodation, even with the help of state support such as the housing assistance payment. And also a lack of supply of affordable housing for both rent and purchase by middle income households. After the last economic crash in 2007, 2008, our housing development sector restructured, and most of the supply we've had then is aimed at either renters on higher incomes from the build to rent sector, or homeowners in the kind of trading up higher income category. And there's very little supply coming onto the market that would be affordable to low to middle income households. So there are significant challenges we had before the crisis. They were significant concerns for voters, we know, during the election. And COVID-19 hasn't made those housing challenges disappear. It may have tempered these problems. So for instance, we see a lot of Airbnb accommodation being freed up in the centre of Dublin that can be used for housing. We may see rents and house prices fall, but we know from the last recession that this kind of tempering of the housing supply, housing affordability problems we have is likely to be temporary. Depending on how quickly the economy recovers, they're going to re-emerge. The issue is just when and at what scale. COVID-19 has, however, created some new and very urgent housing problems, and I particularly want to flag the impact on homelessness. So this graph looks at the patterns in homelessness in Ireland in recent years. So overall levels of homelessness it covers people in emergency state-funded accommodation for homeless people. Measured using that metric, homelessness has increased by 200% since 2005. 70% of homeless people are single adults. Most of these are living in dormitory accommodation in homeless hostels. Homeless families are generally in bed and breakfast accommodation in the homeless hubs. So all of these types of accommodation make social distancing very, very difficult. Now, in the last month, Dublin City Council in particular, because most homeless people are in Dublin, and also the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive have done amazing work in moving homeless people out of hostels and B&Bs into former Airbnb accommodation and also into hotels. And really, I think they really haven't got the credit they deserve for the, that quick action. But these are also temporary solutions to the problem, because as I mentioned, as the economy increases, tourists come back, Airbnb demand will increase, demand for hotels will increase. So assuming we're 12 or 15 months away for a vaccine from COVID-19, people can't socially distance in homeless accommodation. So I think what an urgent matter is to try provide enough permanent separate housing units for those people who are in homeless accommodation currently. What are the implications of all of this for the proposals made by all the political parties in the recent general election and the manifestos? I found this graphic from a fascinating website called the Manifesto Archive, because I didn't want to single out any party. Because in the election, all political parties proposed significant increases in public spending on housing. There was a difference in the scale. There was a difference in the focus of spending. Fianna Fáil, for instance, focused more on affordable housing for sale for new home or aspirant homeowners. Other political parties focused more on social housing output. But all parties proposed significantly increased state involvement in housing, something I support. But all those proposals were predicated on the assumption that there was 11 billion of additional fiscal space available to spend on housing. And in some cases, they were based on assumptions of significantly higher levels of spending or fiscal space available. So now that we're in a post-COVID-19 world, this raises questions about whether those commitments are still going to be affordable in view of the unprecedented economic contraction we're facing, hopefully short term, but still sharp. And also in view of the fact that there are competing priorities for public spending, including social welfare, as John has outlined, and also health and childcare. So just to move on then, and to talk a little bit about what the housing policy and homelessness policy response to the COVID-19 pandemic should be, and to put forward some policy proposals. I think this emergency needs a strong housing policy response, and I'll talk a little bit more about why in a couple of minutes. The emergency may actually bring some housing policy type opportunities, which I'll talk a little bit about again. But I think the challenge we face is the response to the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of housing policy can't just be more of the same. I think we need more government involvement in housing, certainly, but not necessarily more of the policies we've been applying in recent decades, just more of them. We need a new solution, a different approach that's more strategic, better managed, and more affordable. So as I said, I have some ideas in this regard, which I'll just go through. Robert mentioned the need for to avoid a kind of a pro-cyclical response to the pandemic, and I think in terms of housing policy, there is a strong argument for a counter-cyclical capital investment. It does strike me when looking at the figures Robert quoted about the different sectors of the economy affected. There are practical barriers we face to trying to stimulate some of those sectors. For instance, stimulating restaurants, bars, hospitality. We do face a challenge that where are we going to be returning very quickly to a situation where we're all packing ourselves into bars, or where tourists come back to the country. So construction and building sites have the potential to reopen once the spread of the virus is contained, and once there's proper social distancing enforced. So construction is one of the few economic stimuli which is viable in the kind of context we're in at the moment. Within construction, housing creates most jobs. And in my view, there is an opportunity for government, perhaps in the form of the LDA, to procure land and also construction at much lower prices now than we would have in the past. The Land Development Agency was transferred existing state land, but I think there is an argument for procurement of additional sites to ensure we get delivery in the locations where it's most needed, and then procuring construction on the land and lower prices to protect jobs in construction, but also to ensure best value for the taxpayer, and procuring construction should achieve much better value for the taxpayer than using turnkey, purchase of turnkey developments. Now, a pro-cyclical investment strategy would, of course, run counter to the pattern we've had in terms of capital investment right since the 1980s. And in fact, to my knowledge, the last recession we successfully used a counter-cyclical capital investment strategy in was the 1950s. So since the 1980s, we have been cutting capital investment as the economy falls and increasing it as it increases. And just to illustrate that, I've just included a graph there on social housing output and therefore public spending, which has risen through the recovery in the 90s, collapsed through the last recession, and then increased again as the recession abated. And there's a very good reason why policymakers, politicians, civil servants move to cut capital investment and invest pro-cyclically rather than counter-cyclically. There's a very good political reason anyway, and that is that it's much easier to cut capital investment than it is to cut current spending on things like social welfare, public sector, etc. So in this current crisis we're in, additional spending on housing, and the argument I've made, the need for housing to be used as a stimulus, also requires reform of arrangements for raising and managing housing financed by government. There is an opportunity to raise government debt at very low interest rates. I was pleased to hear Robert saying that in the short term that shouldn't be an issue. the capacity for this is not unlimited, and also any debt has to be serviced, even at low interest rates, debt has to be serviced. And in Ireland, we have a very unusual way of funding social housing compared to the rest of Western Europe. We're unique in Western Europe in the fact that social housing is almost 100% government financed. It's all on the government balance sheet as public spending or public debt, no matter whether it's delivered by local authorities or by housing associations, approved housing bodies in the non-profit sector. Social housing in the rest of Western Europe is funded by public borrowing, but also commercial borrowing that isn't treated as government debt. And also, unlike Ireland, is self-funding in the long run. So in countries like the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Austria, that have large social housing sectors, in those countries there were subsidies to encourage supply, particularly in the post-war decades. But over the long term, those loans, it's mainly loans, have been repaid by rents. And the tenants' rents currently go to fund new supply. So the sector is self-funding. So we should examine the best of these models and try to apply them to Ireland. One of the main reasons why social housing is self-funding in the long run in the west of Western Europe is that the value of any public subsidy, a grant or a cheap loan or an interest or a loan guarantee, they're commonly the methods used to apply a subsidy. The value of that subsidy is retained and recycled within the system. So in Amsterdam, accommodation that was built using public subsidies in the 1950s is still generating rents, even though the debt has been paid off, and those rents then can subsidise new supply and sometimes repay government. In Ireland, by contrast, we still sell our social housing to tenants in the council housing sector at very significant discounts from market value. Currently, we sell it at 40 to 60% of market value, and we sold 500 units in 2018, which is the last year for which data is available. And that means then that obviously the tenant benefits, but the next government has to go in and fund new supply. Also, council tenants have a right under the 1966 Housing Act to inherit their parents' or indeed grandparents' tenancy. If they qualify for social housing, they must qualify for social housing, but they wouldn't necessarily need to be in a position where they would get social housing after queuing up on the waiting list like everybody else. We don't have firm data on it, but from my discussions with local authorities, this seems high numbers of tenancies are inherited, particularly in rural areas. And all of this means then the state has to go back in and reinvest. The costs are socialised, costs of providing social housing are socialised, the kind of profits, so to speak, are privatised. And the next government has to go back and reinvest. So I think there's a very strong argument for limiting those rights. If we did, it would free up more family housing in particular to house people in homelessness and also on the waiting list. The manifestos also proposed building what's called affordable housing for sale to households who can't get access to home ownership. Increased home ownership is something I believe is important, social objective. But some of the manifestos propose providing affordable housing for sale at very low prices, which I'm concerned could not be provided without significant public subsidies. So it means the public subsidises that particular owner. They get a house at a rate that's affordable for them. But it's really just what I call temporarily affordable housing. It's affordable for the first person, and then they sell it on at market value, so it's not affordable again. And it means we can't recycle the subsidy. So that's a policy I personally would have concerns about. I also think there's potential for Land Development Agency investment to be recycled. The agency was set up with the objective that it would be given a pot of money of 1.25 billion from government that would be used to invest in housing. And that hasn't been done yet, but will be when the agency's legislation is finally enacted. And there is potential for recycling a large proportion, not all, but a large proportion of that fund to buy land, develop, sell on some dwellings for homeowners, or to others and recycle and invest again. And that I think should be a strong focus. Then to raise a fourth suggestion, in recent decades, housing policy in Ireland has been largely a social policy. Now, I work in the social policy school, and I think social policies are a good idea, but there is a need to have a stronger economic policy focus for housing policy. In particular, I think there's a need to address the weak market supply of affordable housing for middle income groups. It was a big concern in the election. Government has tried to address this during the pandemic period by freezing rents, which is, I think, a perfectly reasonable response considering the situation lots of households face. And rent control is something I don't generally have a problem with, except one, and that is all the research shows that rent control doesn't permanently suppress rents. All it does is redistribute rent increases. So it redistributes rent increases from current tenants to people who are trying to get a tenancy, or it redistributes them over time. So it's not an effective long-term solution to lack of affordability. Some of the political party manifestos propose developing a cost rental tenure where dwellings are rented at cost price. And this is something I think has a lot of potential to address both problems of undersupply of housing at the kind of lower to mid tier of the market, and also affordability problems, because a cost rental would compete against market rents and try to depress them. Renting could be also self-funded if rents are set at cost. And I've underlined that because some of the manifestos mentioned cost rents at levels which certainly in my view are well below actual cost, and then would require significant ongoing government subsidy. But if rents are set at cost, I think, and we try to keep costs as low as we can, I think there is a potential for a tenure there that could make quite a significant difference to housing on affordability in cities where affordability problems are concentrated. And then just finally, this is kind of a niche proposal aimed at addressing homelessness in particular, and the problems I raised in relation to people being in congregated accommodation in homeless hostels, unable to socially distance. This is what I call a small houses strategy. So it's not correct to assume that more social housing will necessarily solve homelessness. And in fact, there are European countries with very large social housing sectors and quite large homelessness problems. And one of the reasons why just more of the same won't solve homelessness is the social housing stock we have is mainly targeted at housing what are now larger families. So 61% of the local authority housing stock is 3 or 4 bedrooms. I have a little graphic there illustrating that, and you'll notice that the figures are really skewed by Dublin City Council, that has a lot of 2-bedroom apartments, and in most of the rest of the country, 80 to 90% of the local authority stock is 2-bedroom houses. Most of the output of housing in recent years has also been larger houses. So it's not providing suitable accommodation for the majority of homeless people who are either single people or lone parent families with 1 child, two-person households. So we need a strategy that will enable us to address this. And Finland is the only Western European country, and to my knowledge, the only country in the world that has managed to basically eliminate homelessness down to extremely small levels. And if you look at what they've done, one of the most important interventions there was they set up a foundation called the Y Foundation, which stands for something unpronounceable in Finnish, but it went out and bought or built a huge number of small units, a small housing strategy, and passed those over to social housing landlords to house homeless people. So I think in view of the issues we have about managing homeless accommodation in the within the pandemic, there's a strong argument for doing that. So thank you everybody for listening, and I hope you all stay well.